Well, good morning, everyone. Good to see everyone. Welcome for those, again, at home. So we're going to continue in the format we've been doing through Advent, which is just to have a conversation. So Bud and I will start us off with our thoughts, and then we will get you all to share as well, if you want to, no pressure, what you hear and questions that you have, things that you see. So Bud's going to start us off with the Matthew reading with some instruction.
Yeah, so on the website, whether you go to the services page or the virtual church page, you'll see down, if you scroll down, Advent Week 3, you'll see it there. And next to the Matthew text, there's a link you can click that has this alternative genealogy of Jesus Christ. Again, from Dr. Gaffney's lectionary that she put together. It's fabulous. And part of the reason I'm saying that is because I did not take the time to learn how to pronounce all of these new names to me, which also shows you the patriarchal genealogy that I have no problem pronouncing because I memorized it when I was in Bible quiz in 7th grade. And yes, I could quote it in King James if you'd like to hear that.
We don't want to hear it. No.
Chris does.
Maybe later.
I'll quote it later. And so as y'all are pulling that up and just be talking for the next couple of minutes, scan through that and maybe see if you recognize some of the names, any of the names, or see what you notice through that. One of the things that we noticed was not only were a lot of these names unfamiliar to us, but also there's a number in here whose names are not known, yet they're still included in this genealogy because they birthed somebody who's important to the genealogy. And I love that she includes that. So we read through there, a genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of Miriam, the daughter of Anna. And it goes on. And then we get to, whose name is unknown, bore Jesse. And then it goes on. And we get to the names that were lost during the exile to Babylon. It says after the deportation to Babylon, the names of the mothers go unrecorded. These are their sons. It's really significant, I think, to look at it from this lens, and we're going to talk more about that in a little bit, but give you another minute or so to just read through that, scan through that, kind of sit with that. Many women involved, many whose names went unrecorded.
Our second passage this morning is from Ruth, and it is chapter 4, verses 11 through 17. And I'm going to read that aloud for us. All the women and men who were at the gate, along with the elders, said, "We are witnesses. May the faithful God grant that the woman who is coming into your house be like Rachel and Leah. The two of them built up the house of Israel. May you prosper in Ephrathah, and establish a lineage in Bethlehem. And may your house, through the children that the fount of life will give you by this young woman, be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar gave birth to for Judah." So Boaz took Ruth as his own for a wife. He came to her, and the source of life granted her a pregnancy, and she gave birth to a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the faithful God, who has not deprived you this day of next of kin, and may the child's name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a provider in your latter years. For your daughter-in-law has given birth to him, she who loves you, she who is more to you than 7 sons." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her bosom, and she fostered him. The neighbor women gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed, and he became the father of Jesse, the father of David. So, again, kind of noticing in the text what stands out. And as Bud and I were having a conversation about this week, one of the things that stood out to both of us so strongly was the bearing witness piece. In the genealogy, we have the story, those who bore witness to the grand story of redemption. In the story of Ruth, we have these people who bore witness to the marriage of Boaz and Ruth, the coming of the baby, the celebration of life, and the blessing on Naomi. And especially, as Bud said, those who go unnamed are present. We don't have their names, but they were there. They were the ones who literally bore witness of the continuing work of God. And I also see this thread of joy underneath it all, as we think about, especially in the Ruth passage, the way that Naomi lost everything, and in the end, this adoption of Obed happened. This adopted son brings joy to her, even in the midst of the loss that she endured throughout her story. So we see this theme of adoption, of redemption, of pulling forward the stories that all these people were a part of. Even in the psalm that I read at the beginning of the service, there's this remembering, telling the stories, bearing witness, continuing to bear witness to what's happening in our world. These are important things to keep in mind as we move forward. So those are just a couple of things that I wanted to highlight in the text.
And sticking with that theme of joy, I was reminded of this quote from Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis. It was actually one of the podcasts that we discussed on Wednesday night. But she described joy as satisfaction resourced with truth. And thinking about joy, sometimes it's hard to name what joy is. It's hard to see something and call it joy unless you're really paying attention to it. But reading this passage, like what is a greater truth than noticing somebody's life and the life that they then brought on and carried on into the world, and the satisfaction that comes from bringing life into the world, that truth that is. And so going with this idea of joy being something that's deeper than happiness, I like to describe it as like this resonant hum that we notice in the world, but only if we pay attention, like that electric static you notice, or maybe if we tune into, I think it's the refrigerator over there. Like it becomes white noise, but if we calm for a second, we sit there. Maybe some audiophiles in the room can't tune it out. And I hope it's that way for joy. But it's this resonant hum that's underneath everything if we slow down and we pay attention to it. So when we hear our stories and we retell other people's stories, or in the Hebrew Scriptures, when it's remember what the Lord has done for you, remember, we are testifying to this truth, this joy that's resourced with the truth of all of God's faithfulness, all of the faithfulness that we've witnessed from our friends. That happens when we listen to each other's stories. So it's like this electric buzz that we can only hear and maybe even feel if we're still long enough and we pay attention. And kind of like we did last night, some of us may be feeling the vulnerability, hangovers. We were bearing witness. We were still long enough to look people in the eyes and hear their stories and bear witness to that part of life that they were sharing with us. So when we do calm down, when we do sit still, we can notice that life itself, even what seems mundane, is full of meaning, resonating with meaning.
Yeah, I was thinking about what happened last night. For those of you who don't know, we had a community dinner and we played a game in which we shared stories together. And this is, I think, the third time that it's happened. I've only experienced it twice, but to be in that space, it was like a holy moment or moments of just sharing our stories. Not all of the stories were happy stories, or maybe obviously joyful in any sense of that. I mean, there's definitely laughter and there were fun stories that people told and all of that. But there was something very holy about us sitting together and holding each other's stories and And it happened last night, but it also happens every time that we're present with one another, every time we hold space with people through really hard times or through really great times, whether we're celebrating or grieving or just like in the midst of anxiety as we sit together, as we bear witness with one another to all of the highs and lows and just like even keel times of our lives, there's power in bearing witness with each other. And as we hold on to each other, we are remembering together. We're remembering, right? Like put a little dash in between. We are remembering. We're coming together. We are binding together, holding each other in the bearing of witness to each other. And so, as a historian, I think telling stories is really important. And not just the stories of our past, the truth of the stories of our past, but also the stories of our present and where we are in the moments right now, and how do we share that with one another now. And sometimes it's the stories of the past that we need to remember in order to get through the present situations that we're going through now. And so the power of community in that space is really it's powerful. It's holy. There's that hum of joy underneath the surface of it. I love that. With the truth of it. So, yeah. We have to tell our stories and the truth of our stories.
I think the only other thing I left out was how often mundane the stories of our lives are, but how just packed full of even the mundane is. Like we are bearing witness in these stories to women who are giving birth, which you think everybody in this room has been birthed. Like we all share that in common, and that seems like the most mundane thing, yet it's the most incredible thing that we all exist, that we have life, and we're all unique in that. So again, finding that hum of joy that's underneath even the most mundane things, and we can look at each other and call that out too when we see it, just like we did last night. But doesn't take a special dinner party and prompts from Esther Perel to do it. We can do that on our own. The magnanimity of the everyday life. We can be witnesses to that.
Yeah, and I think even with the genealogies, confession time, like I just skip right over those. I'm like, blah, 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 because blah, blah, blah. And let's get to the narrative part of the story, right? Because that's just like the mundane part, right? But there's meaning in that. There's meaning in the telling of that story, in the monotony of the rhythm of the genealogies. There's the meaning in that, and the women and men who are witnesses to that, like birth was the mundane thing, and what we get to see because of hindsight is how important those mundane things are to the story of redemption pulling forward.
So what shimmers for you in those texts that we are reading, and maybe some thoughts that we shared with you? Where does your mind and your heart go?
I'd like to just pause for a second and say that I love that you said what shimmers for you. Fantastic language right there. Good job.
Not original to me. Credit to lots of books, I guess. People in my life.
What glistens? So what's glistening for me? I was thinking about this word truth when we're telling our stories. And for me, especially in this time of my life, and I think for a lot of us, even like telling the story of our families, right? Whether it's family of origin or the families we've created. And there are many lenses, many truths of those stories, and some are sweet and like positive, and it's the stories you want to tell to people, like as in like, oh, this is nicely wrapped up. And then there's the stories that are hard and also truthful and seemingly in paradox with each other, as far as like whose lens you're looking through. So was thinking about that in my life, and thinking about that also in therapy and working with people, and how much is like someone telling their story over and over again, and having the chance to look at different lenses, and how that can be healing. But there's a maturity to hold all those pieces, and the paradox of the truths.
The paradoxes of everybody's truths, holding that tension together. We come back to paradox a lot in here. And I think about, it's a relatively well-known imagery, but when we have, a bunch of blind people walk into the woods and encounter what we know because we have our sight, an elephant, but one person only feels the tail, and they're like, well, it's a whip. And because of their perspective, that's what they see. And so another person's like, oh, it's a tree, because they encounter the massive legs of the elephant. But it's not until everybody experiences the elephant from everybody else's angle do we get a better sense that it's an actual elephant. But if we just take one story, one truth, one perspective, then everybody's like, yeah, no, it's a whip, but it's not, because you have to go to a different side of the elephant and explore that and hear everybody's experiences. So that's really helpful. And we'll never get the full sense of the elephant, right? Because if we're talking about God, especially, not just our own stories, but God, there's the never-ending mystery of it all that is the paradox. So that's really good. Thank you.
Well, it's not fully formed thoughts. It's just things that shimmered and I wanted to talk about. So in talking, the first passage, talking about bearing children and bearing children, and then bearing witness. So just looking at the two different, the ways that we use those phrases. And I remember Katie from 3 years ago or something talking about what else can be birthed and gestating. And so for those of us who do not have children or are not going to have children, what does that look like to be a part of birthing something and bearing something and gestating something? So those were the things that kind of came to mind of how, yeah, anyway.
No, I was just kind of struck this time in a way that I hadn't before, about the kind of the terror of childbirth, especially this time, and just the joy of being alive, and just the astonishing kind of mortality rates and. Yeah, so I'm just kind of sitting with that, kind of imagining that kind of is the kind of the other way of telling the story, the parts that gets cut out of the genealogy of just just all the terror and the loss, and so kind of figuring out where to situate the joy, in the midst of that kind of terror of imagining being pregnant and I don't know if I'm going to survive this, and many don't.
The birth is in ways mundane, but there's also the risk that these mothers, these women went through to gestate and then go through labor. And we were actually talking about this last night, that it's, for us, it feels less risky, though more so than it did even a few months ago in a lot of ways. But all over the world, that having children there is terror attached. There is fear attached to it, because what if this doesn't work out? What if life doesn't come from this? So thank you for pointing that out, Chris.
Two thoughts. One, the genealogies are boring and mundane, but they're also an amazing production of faith. The act of a people looking back on generations that have massive disruption. We just kind of passed right over deportation as a word there in the text. And the kind of upheaval and cataclysm and not knowing if you're going to survive as a people, as a family. And then kind of what we see in the genealogy is this retrospective act of faith and of claiming that you can indeed trace God's faithfulness over generations in the face of absolute disaster. And so just that kind of, dry rhythm, one generation to another, is in fact like this incredible act of faith to look back and to see still God's faithfulness through death and disruption, deportation, scattering, loss, and so on. One thought. Second thought is, I think that they were right about the hum, the thrum, the refrigerator noise of joy in the Ruth text, but also just to notice for me that the joy has certain kind of wave as well. It sort of has an intensity, intensification, and that Ruth story is so poignant because of Naomi's loss. The story starts with her saying, "The Lord, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Don't call me Naomi," which means delight or sweet, but call me bitter. That's what she says. Call me Mara, bitter. And then the end of the story is kind of this arc that her life traces from real devastation and emptiness and call me bitter because of what God has done to me, to this moment at the end of this unexpected, weird direction of, again, sort of like just fullness at the end, plenitude, new life.
Reading off the genealogy and kind of like the cadence of kind of being reminded of ancestors, and I've kind of like this something that's been passed on, this faith that's kind of like being kind of carried on, and just kind of what it's like to kind of show up, on a Sunday morning, as kind of, in a sense, kind of the fruit of that kind of ancestral tradition, and when it's, like when I don't, my thoughts are kind of all over the place now, but not because you, of continuing to kind of like echo the faith of the ancestors, even if, when I kind of feel my own sterility, sometimes,
That's good. You should say more of that.
No.
The sense of witnessing that has been mentioned reminds me of the role that holy witnessing or remembering can hold in our spiritual communities. In Arabic, there is a term called zikr that forms the essence of Sufi worship in the sort of mystical branch of Islam, which includes what we all know as like the whirling dervishes, but they're recalling to themselves the beautiful names of Allah, the beautiful names of God in community with each other. And in the Christian tradition, the term is anamnesis. It's a Greek word that is invoked in our sense of celebrating communion or Eucharist. And it's a remembering, but it's not solely a remembering of the past, but it's like an invocation. It's of making the past present in the eternal now. And so it's as we sometimes say in our English word, it's like a remembering when we partake of the body of Christ, not only the historical Jesus, but the we who assemble here and now. And it's not lost on me that, Eucharist or communion was originally celebrated in the context of a full meal. So there is this sort of, verticality of remembering God and of Christ, but there's also that remembering that comes in the witnessing of one another and of our stories. And I find that in my own sort of faltering contemplative practice, that it even begins with a remembering within myself. Various spiritual traditions as well as internal family systems model of consciousness note that we don't have like one consistent I. Like we have a whole family and ecosystem of different aspects of ourselves that all dare to speak in the first person for the whole of us. And when I am living frenetically from one moment to another, and I'm not practicing zikr, I'm not practicing anamnesis, I'm not practicing remembrance, it's like a sort of existential indigestion, because it's like I'm just living life and I'm going from one thing to the next, and I haven't really taken the time to pause and to say, what was that? How do I feel about that interaction or that experience? And have I truly let it in to the whole of me? And sort of taking that time to even just try to observe myself. How am I holding my body? How am I holding my posture? What is my breath like? Even taking 5 minutes a day to do that, I find helps me to digest my life better, which enables me to witness and remember those around me better. And so when I think of this Advent reflection, thinking of just the different roles of holy remembering, starting inside of me and kind of moving outward to larger and larger witnessing presences, and how could we as communities of faith also begin to witness the larger world, and how it's truly being seen on community-wide levels. How healing can that possibly be? Because I know how healing it can be when I witness myself.
I'm so glad you brought up the participatory nature of this remembering. We've talked about community, but it's not just we're saying things. We're participating in the Eucharist. Spiritual indigestion, yeah. The wrong kind of heartburn. Yeah. Well, Jesus sets my heart on fire or something. I think there was something I learned in youth group. Yeah. That's what these wafers are. Anybody else have anything they want to share?
The idea of slowing down and reflecting on interactions, and how for me in my life it's like there was a training of, oh, I'm okay, like kind of this graciousness, and I don't want to take up too much space with having big feelings about this, or my own judgments about other people who would have big feelings. I'm like, what is your problem? Can't you just get over this or that? And the steady retraining of myself, of course in my profession, right? Because I'm for other people, bearing witness to their own and honoring their own experiences in life. But then to do it for myself, but that's taking up space, right? To either reflect inside myself or reflect with someone else, or to say this matters to me, this interaction that may not have meant anything to you meant something to me. And that takes a lot of courage. So
It's good you bring back courage too, because Melody, you're talking about truth, and not just the rosy truth that we learn in our history books, but the actual truth, and it takes courage to speak that. I like that theme coming back too.
And just to reiterate what Aline said too, I kind of said the truth. Well, there's the truth that we've heard in our history books, but there's this other truth too of the people, the losers, if you will, because history is written by the winners in a lot of respects. And so both of those can be true from a certain perspective, and it's not until we get the whole picture that we see a fuller understanding of that. So it is, I think it's acknowledging the truths of everybody's stories and just holding that tension. I do not do this well. I do not do this well because I see things obviously the right way. But to be able to just to hold one another's stories and just to hold them without trying to correct or trying to make it into the way I see it is we don't do it well, or I don't do it well. Some people do. But how do we do that in a way that we can then hold each other well, remember well together, love each other, hold space for each other well when our truths sometimes don't seem to work together.